Hello back, dear students. We are still in chapter 3 with the analysis of demand and supply. In the previous lecture, we discussed markets and prices as well as the demand side of the market. In this lecture, we are going to discuss the supply side. So let's begin. Using the same reasoning as we did with demand, we first need to know what do we mean by supply, or what are the conditions for supply to occur. The first condition is that the producer should have access to the resources and technologies that would enable him to produce the good. And this condition represents the constraints that limits the producer's ability to produce the good. The second condition is that the producer can profit from producing it, meaning that producing the good is profitable for him. This is because the primary goal of the producer is to maximize his profit or to achieve the highest possible profit. One final condition is that the producer plans to produce and sell the good. Now let's turn to another question, which is what determines the supply of a good, or more precisely, what are the factors that affect the supply of a good? Actually, there are many factors that determine the supply of a product. The first and most important one is the price of the good itself. But there are other factors that affect the demand also, which include the costs of production, the technology used, expected future price, the size of the market, and so on. Let's begin by the law of supply, which explains the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied of it. As we previously discussed, the law of supply states that there is a direct relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied of it, holding other things constant. Which means that a rise in the price causes the quantity supplied to increase and vice versa. But why this direct relationship exists? We have three reasons. The first one is that because of increasing opportunity cost, as we discussed in chapter 2. After reaching a certain limit, as the production of a good increases, the cost of producing more of it increases. So the producer requires a higher price to offer more of that good. In this respect, we sometimes refer to the supply as reflecting the minimum price required to offer one more unit of the good. The second reason why there is a direct relationship between the price of the good and the quantity supplied is that the price is a revenue for the producer, and then rising prices constitute increased profitability for him. Also, rising prices for a relatively long time induces more producers to enter the market and increase the supply. To this end, we can represent the law of supply using the supply schedule that reflects this entire relationship numerically, showing the quantities supplied that the producer is willing to offer at each and every price. Also, this law can be represented graphically using the supply curve. It is important to remember that any direct relationship between two variables is represented graphically by an upward sloping curve. The curve that starts from the bottom at the left and up to the right, as we will see in this figure. We see that at the price of 2, the producer is not willing to offer any units of the product. What this means? This means that this price does not cover his cost. As the price rises to $4, he will increase the quantity supplied, or he is willing to supply 2 units of this good. If the price increased further to $6, the producer is willing to offer 4 units of the good. As the price increases further to 8, now he's willing to offer 6 units of the good. Finally, if the price increases to 10, the producer will be willing to supply 8 units of the good. Also, if the price rises further to 12, he will be willing to supply 10 units of the good. And this indicates the positive relationship between the price and the quantity supplied, as we see that the price increases and causes the quantity supplied to increase, moving upwards the supply curve from one point to another. After explaining the effect of the price of a good on its supply, we are going to discuss what other factors might affect the supply. These factors include the cost of production, which is an important factor that affects the supply of a good. In this respect, it is important to note that the cost of producing a good can be affected by the price of resources used in producing it, such as the wages, interest, or rents. Also, the technology used to produce the good and the government policies that affect the production, such as taxes and subsidies that the government imposes on production. As the cost of production increases, the price of a good and the price of the good remains constant, the producer decreases his supply and vice versa. And therefore, we can say that there is a direct relationship between the costs of production and the supply of a product. For example, if wages increases, the cost of producing the good increases, and therefore the producer will supply less. Also, an improvement in technology reduces the cost of production and thus increases supply. Another example is that if the government reduces production taxes imposed on the producer, the cost of producing the good declines, and thus the producer will increase his supply. Another factor is expected future prices. If the producer expects a rise in the price of his good in the near future, he will decrease his current supply until the price rises and then supply the stored amount. And therefore, we can say that there is an inverse relationship between the expected future price and the supply of a good. Also, the market size affects the supply. As the number of sellers increases, the supply will increase. But we need to know what happens to the supply when any of these factors change. For example, if wages changes or if wages decline, the price of the good and the price of the good remains constant and other factors also remains constant, this means that the producer will be willing to supply more of the good at each price. This means that there will be a new supply curve that is located to the right of the original one. Let's see this in the graph. If there is a decline in wages, we said that the cost of production will decline, which means that the producer is willing to supply at the same price. If the price is 2, he was not willing to supply any units of the good. Now he's willing to supply 2 units of the good. And if the price increases to 4, the supply was willing to supply 2 units. Now he's willing to supply 4 units. As the price increases further to 6, he will now supply more of the good, and so on. This means that the supply curve shifted to the right, which means that at each of the old prices, the supplier now or the producer now is willing to supply more of the product. Finally, as we did in demand, there is a difference between movement along the supply curve and shifts of the curve. This difference arises from the different effects of a change in the price of a good and changes in other determinants of supply. As we see in the figure in the left, a change in the price of the good will affect the quantity supplied, or the quantity supplied will change as a result of a change in the price of this product. As the price increases, the quantity supplied increases and vice versa. And this leads to a movement along the curve. Let's see how. If the prices be as strict, in this case, the producer is producing Q asterisk. If this price increases to P1, this supplier, if the price increases to P1, this supplier will increase his production, which means that the quantity supplied will increase. Here we moved from point B to point A on the supply curve. We moved up the supply curve. Alternatively, if this price declines to B2, the producer will produce less or will offer less units in the market. This means that we moved from point B down to point C, but we are still on the same curve. This is why we call it a movement along the curve. As the price increases, the quantity supplied increases, moving up the supply curve, and as this price decreases, the quantity supplied decreases and we move down the supply curve from point B to point C. But what happens if any of the other factors change? When any of the other factors changes, such as the cost of production, the technology, the number of sellers, any of these factors will cause the supply curve to shift. The supply curve will shift to the right if the supply increases, and it will shift to the left if the supply decreases. Now we have completed our explanation of the supply side of the market. See you in the next lecture.